I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We include your questions and comments, and we cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely stimulating topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. Our guest this episode is Tom Singer. Thomas Singer is an MD, psychiatrist, and Jungian psychoanalyst trained at both Yale and Dartmouth medical schools and the CJ Jung Institute in San Francisco. He's also an award-winning author, editor, and essayist, regularly featured in Substack, and one of the over 24 psychiatrists and psychologists who offer a consensus view in the 2017 best-selling book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, on President-elect Donald Trump's mental state being a clear and present danger. His most recent book, based on 3 years of podcasts, is Mind of State, Conversations on the Psychological Conflicts Stirring U.S. Politics and Society. Let me welcome Dr. Tom Singer. Good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, delighted. I thought we'd begin. You know, there's a notion in any kind of broadcast that you maybe save the best for last, or you begin with the best, or I always begin with something that's current. Trump was just reelected as president of the United States, is not inaugurated until January. But I want to go back for a moment with you to the book that you and Bandy X. Lee and a number of others put out. Bandy X. Lee was sort of was she the kind of leader in this process?
She's very much the leader of this project, yes.
She's a Yale forensic psychiatrist, and she's also someone who said we weren't breaking with the Goldwater rule, which says you can't diagnose someone unless it's a patient. We were, in some instances, just giving professional opinions or evaluations, but some of the assessments were sort of charged with breaking the Goldwater rule. And I don't want to get into that. What I'm interested in is if the diagnosis, and there was a diagnosis, which was, I think, malignant solipsism, we can get into that, does that still hold?
I think that there wasn't one diagnosis. There were 27 different psychotherapists expressing opinions. So as you can imagine, there were several different opinions about what Donald Trump psyche was like, or what his psychopathology might be like. The malignant solipsism was Robert Lifton's diagnosis, but there were several others. He was considered a sociopath, and he was considered a malignant narcissist. There were lots of different diagnostic labels applied, not indiscriminately, but it certainly did raise questions about the Goldwater rule.
And Robert Lifton is probably the most prominent and the most well-known of all the psychiatrists and psychologists who were part of that project. But it was based on the idea of a duty to warn the public. And whether it's malignant solipsism or narcissism or a personality disorder or sociopathic or cognitive decline, which we can talk about as well, there was an implicit warning in that to the public, wasn't there?
Yes, I think that Bandy Lee's notion of getting around the questions of of whether or not the Goldwater rule was violated was basically suggesting that there was an even more important underlying value, which is the duty to warn if there's a danger to the public, and that was the rationale for publishing this book. And I think all of the considerations that were mentioned in 2016, as far as I'm concerned, they're still absolutely true, perhaps even more so now than then.
Some of the fear that was attached to the first Trump presidency was that he would use nuclear weapons, that he was too impulsive, too beyond control, self-control, and so forth. And yet now it seems like most of his animus, I'll use a good Jungian word, because we are going to be talking about Jung, that it's directed toward internal enemies as he sees them, or his adversaries, or those that he seeks retribution with. In other words, things have taken kind of a shift, haven't they?
I think that's correct. I think the fear in 2016 was that he was so impulsive, he was going to get us into trouble internationally. And because he is impulsive, the gravest fear of all, of course, was that he was the one who would have his hands or fingers on nuclear weapons. And I agree with you that right now, that I think our fears are much more that he's going to turn his wrathful vengeance on his domestic enemies. I think I think there's good reason to be afraid. I think that his, newest appointment for Attorney General is apparently somebody who really has it in for the Democrats and others who attacked Donald Trump. So yes, I think the fear now is less about nuclear women. Nuclear women. Well, we'll call that a Jungian slip.
Yeah, it's a great Jungian slip.
It's less about nuclear war than it is about really savaging our government. I'm sure you're familiar with Timothy Snyder, who's
Yes.
written quite extensively about his fears for democracy, and he wrote a very interesting article about the appointments for the cabinet. And his notion is that Trump's goal is to decapitate the United States government, and he's going to do that systematically. He's going to go after the FBI and the intelligence and the judicial and health, education, and welfare, that he's systematically going to try and, as Timothy Snyder says, to decapitate the U.S. government. So, yes, I think the fear is that he's far more of a danger domestically now than he might be internationally.
Although there are those counter arguments that he's setting a different kind of precedent, he's shaking things up, he's fighting the deep state, and you also hear arguments that go to Antifa being more of a threat in some ways to creating chaos and destroying the domestic government, or being a little bit of devil's advocate here, obviously, but that we have more to fear from the totalitarianism of the woke movement, those kind of counter arguments. And you say what?
I say that Donald Trump raises some really challenging issues for all of us, in the sense that I think there has been a totalitarianism on the left to some extent, and that some of the woke movement has gotten too extreme. And so it's, the Jungian notion of the shadow is that we project out those things that we fear most in ourselves. And I think that Trump is a master of playing the shadow game, in that just as he projects the shadow on to the left, those of us more on the left who are concerned about the shadow worry about our own shadow as well. And I think there is one on the left. So I think one of the reasons that Trump is so provocative is that he forces us to look at his own at our own shadows as well as his. And if he's a master of anything, it's raising all the doubts that we have about ourselves and other people. That's what he does the very best.
Well, you also say that he invades us, that whether those who feel inclined to agree with him and feel that he's going against their enemies and people they see should be in the crosshairs, they feel that they take him in, and that's a good thing. Whereas those who feel the way you do feel that he's invading you. And in fact, you write about this in Substack, one of your Substack pieces, in a very moving way, about how you felt like felt isolated. You wanted to retreat and remove yourself when he was reelected, but you found hope in music, and you found hope in some of Yeats's poetry. And actually, it was a very elevating piece ultimately. But that sense of his invasion is what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes, I think I wrote about that in 2016. There was a particularly telling episode when one of the many women who came forth to accuse him of alleged sexual abuse related an incident. She was on an airplane, and there was a seat available in first class, and so the stewardess asked her if she wanted to sit in first class, and so she moved up from economy class to first class, and she found herself sitting next to Donald Trump, who, as she alleges, proceeded to grope her physically above and below. And she said she felt like he was an octopus, and all these tentacles were surrounding her. And it's a very vivid description of being caught in the tentacles of this really quite invasive force. And that description really moved me because I think our leaders live inside of us. I think when somebody moves into the White House, they also move into our personal psychic spaces. They live inside of us. And some of them live inside of us more benignly than others. Trump does invade the psyche. And I would say he invades the psyche of both those who are for him and those who are against him. He's very powerful in his ability to get inside of us. If we're against him, it feels like he's tearing us apart inside. If we're for him, we feel like we're elevated by him and we become as big and powerful as he is. So he's very charismatic in that capacity to enter inside both, I think, the personal psyche, but also the collective psyche. It's extremely powerful.
I have to single out a line of yours, which I thought was wonderful. You were talking about Jungian slips before, and of course, that's identified more with Freud, and we'll talk about Freud as well, I'm sure, in this conversation today. But you had a line about taking Freud's notion of the royal road to the unconscious, dreams being the royal road to the unconscious. You said the id is the royal road to the White House. And I must congratulate you on that line because it struck me as very, how shall I say, perspicacious, to put it mildly, but also clever. What do you make, George Conway, Kellyanne Conway's now ex-husband, I guess, who has been very critical of Trump, to put it mildly, as opposed to his wife, that may be the reason why he's an ex now, has said that these recent appointments of his point out some strange, assumptions that maybe there's an attempt to really want to create chaos. Matt Gaetz, who has now stepped down and is no longer the nominee, at least by his own choice, for Attorney General, but others who are at least charged and associated with other kinds of sexual transgressions. You mentioned the octopus. This has been Trump's MO for years now. It's as if he wants people who not only have total loyalty to him and fealty and maybe even sycophantic, but also wants people who will be maybe like Robert F. Kennedy is, like Pete Hegseth is, identified with sexual transgressions the way he is.
Well, he does have a knack for picking people who have gotten in trouble around sexual transgressions. I don't know whether that's part of, maybe he can count on their loyalty to him. I think he has a knack for picking very transgressive people generally, people who are controversial, who do create chaos, and who are uniquely unqualified to the jobs that they're being nominated for. Somebody was just suggesting to me that really what he's doing, he's just trying to troll the left right now with these appointments. This is part of his revenge at getting back at being, he feels hounded by the Democrats who weaponize the judicial system. Nobody has done a better job of weaponizing the judicial system than Donald Trump. The fact that he managed to evade and avoid and delay and obstruct 4 or 5 different counts against him, or charges in different parts of the country. So I think he picks people who are as transgressive as he is, not just sexually, but in terms of wanting to break things apart. Robert Kennedy clearly got derailed some time ago, so he's very bent on breaking apart our notions of vaccines and what's healthy and what's health producing. Gates does too. So he's very good at picking transgressive people, I would say.
And that would include, of course, Tulsi Gabbard, who seems to like dictators, is transgressive in that way. I mean, meeting not only with Assad, but speaking up for Putin in ways that maybe parallel Trump again.
Yeah, it's, part of this notion of the shadow is that if you actually think about things and sometimes doubt yourself, which I think I think many of us do. We come to we listen to ourselves, we think about things, we read, we come to an opinion, and then somebody like Trump comes around and he's so outrageous that initially we're just against him, and then you wonder if for instance, in his wanting to take government apart, is he right in some way? Is there something about our government that's gotten too big and too many laws and too much this and that? Is there? This is where the shadow becomes so powerful in this kind of discussion. In his attack, in his transgressive attack on every established order, which is really what he does. And is there something of value in that? Is there something of value in wanting to challenge things as they are?
Well, I think that makes a good deal of sense, particularly when you put it in the framework of what appears to be a mandate, and at least a popular vote that got him back in the White House. There's also this strange kind of notion coming out of the left now that somehow Elon Musk, there's bromance between he and Trump, has been responsible technologically for turning the blue states into red states. I mean, these conspiratorial theories go on both sides again, don't they?
Yeah, and I think the Elon Musk thing is so complex. Talk about a transgressive, complex character who in his transgressions has been enormously creative and productive, but at the same time, at least in recent years, I think he's really gotten derailed. I think he and his brother, in the biography I read, he hated his father, who had 10 children and was a very paranoid and dictatorial guy.
Still does hate his father, according to what I'm reading. Yeah.
Excuse me.
He still speaks very pejoratively about his father. He hates him.
Now he's becoming just like his father. He's as paranoid, and he's got 10 children, or maybe 11. And I think this would be the Freudian in me. I think he's turned into his father. But the question, actually, excuse me, I got derailed slightly about, is it a conspiracy theory that Musk has converted blue states to red states? And that taps into something I've been thinking about recently, Michael. My most recent Substack was about this. I think that the Russians are very well known for their so-called political technology, which is the mastery of social media and data and so on, to go into a place and turn people's minds around through very selective use of media and data and targeting people where they're people who are most vulnerable on specific issues. And I think I read an article recently in the Washington Post that Musk did some actually quite brilliant use of the Russian political technology to trigger people where they're most vulnerable in what I call their cultural complexes, and that he was quite successful in turning some people around by the use of political technology to tap into the vulnerabilities of very select groups of people, so that he would send messages to Palestinian people or to sympathetic people in Michigan, Muslims who were sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, talking about Kamala Harris being married to a Jew and supporting sending more armaments to the Israelis. And then he would turn around to the Israeli or to Jewish sympathizers in the United States and send messages that Kamala Harris actually wanted to cut off all weapons to the Israelis. Very selective, targeted messaging that actually went out through Musk, through his nonprofit, to target voters to change their opinions. I think there's some truth to that. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I think it's actually true.
In terms of political technology, yeah, probably. But they were talking about Starlink somehow being used, for example. That seems a stretch to me.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, I remember when I was training for a psychiatry residency, and people would come in with the FBI having planted microphones in their teeth. And this is in that realm of paranoia where you get quite crazy. Paranoid ideation is profoundly disturbing, and there's a lot of paranoid ideation in our media today.
In fact, it's probably as bad, if not worse, than it's ever been. I don't know that you can, if you can look back historically, we're in a paranoid state because we're so polarized, so extraordinarily polarized.
Yes, I think we are in a paranoid state, and I think that's because the media has become so fragmented with so many different voices having accent. It used to be access to the media. It used to be we'd have, three mainstream news sources, and they were all pretty much the same. But now there's so many different takes on what's going on that the faith in the information that we're getting, we lose faith in the information we're getting, and we're getting bombarded with so many different points of view that I think things are terribly fragmented. And it's actually, to me, one of the most frightening things about what's going on now, which is what is the truth? How can you sort out what's real and what's unreal, or what's fantasy, or what's a paranoid fantasy? And the really dangerous thing about a paranoid fantasy is that it splits the world into very binary forces of good and evil. And there's no gray, there's no in between. In a paranoid state, it's either you're on the side of the good or you're on the side of the bad. And most of us who are getting older know that life is far more complex than that. And it's not good and evil most of the time. It's often shades of gray and complexity. But our public thinking has become very binary and very paranoid.
That's why I like the idea of the podcast being called Gray Matter, because I like to represent as best I can different points of view. And I should say, you're somebody who's been very critical of Trump. We've had other people critical of Trump, but we've also had Sean Walsh in a podcast, a Republican, and we had Dennis Prager booked until he had a terrible accident. I hope we can rebook him. He endorsed Trump. You hear from both sides, I think, is still at least something to try to strive for. But at the same time, the Washington Post, as you mentioned before, which some people see as being corrupted in so many different ways, especially those on the right look at as being corrupted, or those who are feeling they should have seen an endorsement of Kamala Harris and they didn't because of Jeff Bezos. The Washington Post has counted the number of lies that have come out of Donald Trump, a simple expedition, really, and the number is staggering. I want to go back to something you said before about cultural complexities, because the last election, you were talking about all these archetypes, all these Jungian archetypes, particularly the identification that Trump had with Christ, especially after he was wounded in the ear and 2 attempted assassinations and then resurrected from that. And the flag, like Iwo Jima, I mean, all these symbols carry heavy weight with them to our culture. And then you were talking about Kamala Harris and putting her in a category with a Hindu goddess, the goddess of the universe by different names. How do those actually operate on our psyches? How do they, because you had these podcasts that went on to try to determine why people vote the way they do. Do they vote because of those archetypes, or do they vote and those cultural complexities, you think?
Well, that's a very complex question. And it's a very important question in my mind. When I talk about archetypes and gods and goddesses, and Trump being like a resurrected Christ figure, or Kamala Harris being like a Durga figure who is a warrior goddess in the Hindu religion who cuts to the quick of criminal behavior and so on, I don't mean to be taken literally. I'm not saying they are gods and goddesses. I'm following the notion of, actually, there was a wonderful classicist named Jane Harrison who wrote a series of books, the most important of which was called Themis, in the early 1900s, about classical Greek mythology. And she was very interested in the pre-patriarchal phase of the Greek psyche. And she followed Emil Durkheim, the pioneering sociologist's notion that when we talk about gods and goddesses, we don't need to be taken literally. What we're talking about is how collective emotion, the emotion of large groups of people, can be projected onto a human being with such power that that human being becomes a god or a goddess in the minds of the people who believe in that person. So that one way of thinking about Donald Trump as a Christ-like figure or Kamala Harris as a Durga-like figure is that the collective emotion that gets generated in the people that follow them, who either love or hate them, is so powerful that they become larger than life. And that's an archetype. And that archetypal energy moves voters. It's very powerful. Trump is a very charismatic, cult-like figure who has a messianic kind of mission, and people look at him as if he's a god. That's an archetype.
Well, I've always certainly been drawn to the notion of archetypes, and maybe this can take us into some Jungian territory. You've talked about the shadow. I've been drawn for a number of years to a number of things that we owe credit and certainly even have an obligation where Jung is concerned. And I'm talking about, well, I mentioned animus and anima before. The idea of the shadow, the idea of archetypes, even introverts and extroverts, we owe a debt to Jung, or the idea of an electric complex or synchronicity. I mean, he's illuminated so many things that it's really remarkable. But here again, you have kind of the other side of Jung, and maybe that's his shadow side. I don't think it's his shadow side so much, although he was certainly transgressive with having relations with patients, which anybody would, especially today, condemn. But I'm wondering about some of the other things that we might look at for a moment, which people think are kind of kooky. You know, his being drawn to tarot and Aryan myths and astrology. And I don't want to give anybody cause for exception here. There are people who believe in astrology, you know, like an absolute faith and so forth. But it's a different kind of, shall we say, bag of things that he's identified with as well. What about that binary where Jung is concerned?
Well, it's a really good and important question that's not easily answered. Certainly, many people, particularly in the Freudian tradition, denigrated and dismissed Jung as a woolly-headed mystic. Was the phrase that they used, and felt that a lot of his ideas were not only crazy, but very dangerous. And of course, the most potent of which was that he was, because he got interested in what seized the German people between World War I and World War II, was Hitler's capacity to fascinate the German psyche, and Jung wrote a very famous essay called Wotan about that, which was a northern European god of war and lightning and destruction, and that essay got Jung in a lot of trouble because people felt he was a Nazi sympathizer. I would take exception to that, but he was careless, and he spoke about these very powerful things that move individuals and large groups of people in a way that made them think maybe he was crazy himself. Winnicott, the very famous and wonderful Freudian child analyst, talked about Jung having a psychosis. So there's certainly been a lot of suspicion about Jung over the years.
Excuse me, Tom, doesn't the Red Book sort of reveal psychosis? The famous Jungian Red Book?
Well, yeah, I mean, it reveals a wide open imagination, and what's amazing was that he was able to hold it together, that he was able to do this privately. But I want to get back to sort of his interest in astrology or other things that were considered kooky, because and the tarot, you mentioned that. What he was doing there was he was saying the human imagination projects itself everywhere. It projects itself in religion, it projects itself in astrology, it projects itself in tarot. And so if we look at those projections, we can learn something about the human psyche, which doesn't mean you believe in it. It just tells you the full range of wild and crazy ideas that people can have. And I think he was a great student of that. That doesn't mean he's a follower or an adherent of that. That's where things get confused. If you study something, it means that you believe in it. Of course, some people would say he did believe in those things. I think he believed in them in the sense that he saw them as projections of the human psyche, say in astrology, onto the stars. It's a projection of the human imagination onto the stars. And then these elaborate systems get built. It doesn't mean you believe in that. It just means it's telling you something about what the human psyche is capable of projecting. Is that clear what I just said?
That's quite clear. I'm just wondering, though, where you see, I mean, Jung was for quite some time a disciple of Freud's, and he was going to take over the franchise. And Freud saw this as, being to his advantage because he was so identified as being Jewish, and most of his followers were Jewish, except for Ernest Jones, his British biographer. But he suddenly said, Jung will take over, and, that'll be good because he's a Swiss German and he's Gentile. And in fact, I can't help thinking about Lenny Bruce seeing the world in terms of Jewish and Goyish because, some people feel Freud is much more. Well, Freud was Jewish, of course, and Jung was Gentile, so therefore Goyish. But I was also struck by their last words. It's almost kind of a bit of humor that one can inject in this. Supposedly, Freud's last words were about, feeling that everything didn't make sense and there was nothing that made any sense at all. Look for the exact quote here. Now it is nothing but torture, makes no sense anymore. Whereas Jung said, let's have a really good new kind of wines. That was allegedly his last words. What a gap there is between those two. But the gaps became greater and greater as time went on. In fact, they have this incident in the United States where they actually, this crazy father-son kind of notion, and Freud fainted, right?
Yes, that was when they were traveling together. I think it was in 1907, the famous Clark lectures, and they traveled together, and I think on the boat they were exchanging dreams, and Freud told Jung a dream, and Jung asked for his associations, and Freud said, "I can't give them to you because it will ruin my authority over you." So it. Put it this way, it was a highly charged relationship. These were two, that's 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. These were two extraordinarily bright and gifted men who I would say had a love affair in the sense that they both were passionate about the power of the psyche as opposed to the body, the power of the psyche to move and influence human behavior.
Forgive me, Tom. When you say psyche, you're talking about the mind, but psyche is also the soul, right?
Right. Psychology comes from, actually, it means words of the soul. Yeah. Psychology actually means words of the soul. So when I talk about psyche, it's something about the soul and or the mind. It's kind of a mixture of the two. But when I talk about psyche, it's really the soul. It's the capacity for the human imagination to roam and create ideas and fantasies. That's sort of the psyche. Yeah, they had a very powerful. Their first meeting, they met because they met around. Jung had a very interesting idea about complexes and schizophrenia that Freud found very interesting. Their first meeting lasted 13 hours. They talked together for 13 hours, and there were all sorts of synchronistic events that happened. So this was a meeting between two extraordinary men, and I think historically, I think we're in a position now to say that they were giants and both made huge contributions. For a long time, because they had a falling out, there was simply a war between the Freudians and the Jungians, and it was based often on Jewish-Christian too. As you correctly pointed out, Jung was going to help Freud be accepted into the more Western European world that he wanted access to. But he felt betrayed, and in some ways he was betrayed by Jung. So it was a highly charged relationship that I think now we can look to both of them as having gifted us enormous things. Because prior to that, the so-called psyche wasn't real. Everything was about external behavior. They actually inquired about the mind and our inner lives. And what they did for modern man was they said, maybe we've had too much of it, is that we actually have an inner life that moves us. That was a big deal in the 1900s. Nobody thought about that.
Lots of other things I want to talk with you about, but we've opened up some interesting Pandora's boxes here. We're getting
Totally.
some really good questions, though, and I want to go to the questions that are coming in here and then come back and cover some more territory. Actually, the first question came in from Las Vegas, from Bill. We thank you for the question, Bill. He says, can you speak to Emanuel Swedenborg's influence on Jung's worldview? Talk about giants and titans. I haven't heard Swedenborg's name in quite a while, though, but what comes to your minds? Interesting. There's another Jungian slip. I said, what comes to your minds rather than your mind? But you have that manifold mind, yeah.
I don't know enough about Swedenborg and Swedenborgianism to make an informed comment about that. Although, yeah, that I can't speak to it. It's too far back in my memory. So I think, was it Bill in Las Vegas would probably have a lot more to say than I would.
Well, well, thank him for the question. I'm not going to try to shed light on that. I have some thoughts, but you're the Jungian psychiatrist. I'm going to remain silent here and go to another question from Susan in Los Angeles, who says, how do you see modern technology affecting our collective unconscious or archetypal patterns? Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question because, first of all, what it says is that archetypal patterns are not fixed, that they evolve over time. So, and that's a very important notion that that technology or other developments in human nature can shape archetypes just as archetypes can shape human behavior. And I think that right now, modern technology is using archetypal psychology to manipulate, I believe in this very deeply, to manipulate large groups of people in a pretty destructive way. I'm quite frightened about the increasing capacity of the varieties of our modern technology to mobilize sort of archetypal patterns to turn people against one another. I think that's what's happening right now. I think there was such a promise of technology to make our worlds better and open up the world in all sorts of positive ways. And I'm sure some of that promise has been delivered. But right now, I think we're suffering the ill effects of technology as it manipulates archetypal forces to turn us against one another.
You see danger and clear and present in AI?
I do. I'm frightened. And again, I don't know enough about where it's a great unknown. AI is a great unknown. I'm fearful of technology, including AI, because all of the promises often end up turning out to be Frankenstein's. Maybe Frankenstein was the first modern myth in terms of the human capacity to turn something human into a dangerous and destructive machine. So yes, I'm very afraid. I'm very afraid of where technology is leading us.
Well, again, I read some of your writing about how you feel political technology can trigger us in ways we haven't even imagined. And you actually went to AI yourself to see what it would reveal to you, and you actually used the word thoughtful, which is kind of humanizing.
Yes, well, I put thoughtful in parentheses because I thought, well, why don't I use modern technology to help me see? I had this notion. I was connecting two ideas. One is the Russian notion of political technology, and two was the notion I've been working on for 20 years, which is cultural complexes. It's an idea about unconsciously powerful forces that move us in all sorts of ways. And it occurred to me that there was a relationship between political technology and cultural complexes, which was moving us in very dangerous ways. And then I said, well, I'll turn to technology to see what it has to say about this relationship. And so I went to AI, and it delivered a 10-point answer as to how political technology was exploiting cultural complexes, it staggered me. It was far more thoughtful than I would have been able to give if I were asked to give 10 reasons about the 10 points about how the two were related. I never would have come up with that. It exceeded anything I could have done.
That's a bit frightening in itself. Here's Frank from Denver who wants to know, how important are rituals in grounding cultural identity, and how do we create meaningful ones today? Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, that's I think that rituals are essential, absolutely essential in grounding our identity as individuals and as groups of people. And without rituals, say rituals of mourning when somebody dies that you love, if you didn't have a memorial service or you didn't have some sort of ritual behaviors around what to do with the body and with the deceased, we would feel very incomplete. We need rituals to help us see through the most important transitions that we face in life. We need rituals of graduation from elementary school and high school and college to acknowledge these absolutely essential transitional phases that we go through. We need rituals like Shabbat on Friday night to celebrate the holiness of the week. I mean, without rituals, we're nothing. They are the actions that ground our deepest feelings and beliefs in behavior, so they're absolutely essential.
Did Jung say they were vital to us?
I'm thinking more of Victor Turner now than I'm thinking of Jung. I think Victor Turner, a very famous sociologist, helped us enormously with understanding rituals. I think Jung's emphasis was more on mythology, but of course, with any living mythology, there are all sorts of rituals. So I think they're so deeply interconnected that was really part of Jung's idea, fundamental idea.
Here is Rick from Miami, and thanks for the question, Rick. How do cultural traumas get transmitted across generations, and what strategies might help communities heal from them?
Oh, my. Well, that's just a huge question.
Indeed.
My thinking about this is that historic traumas get imprinted in the human psyche through what I call cultural complexes. Cultural complexes have several characteristics. First of all, they have very specific memories that go along with the trauma or the event. They have very specific ideas about what happened in the traumatic event, such as the Holocaust or the Nakba. There are memories, there are ideas, there are images, and most importantly of all, there are very powerful emotions. And these historic traumatic experiences get constellated, get formed in what I call cultural complexes, and those cultural complexes get handed down from generation to generation. And they're very alive in all of us. Our cultural complexes determine a lot of our behavior, a lot of our sensitivities, a lot of our vulnerabilities. So we see that around issues, say, certainly around racism and the cross-generational transmission around slavery and racism, around homophobia, around misogyny. You name our most powerful contemporary political issues, they're really all transgenerational cultural complexes. Sadly, they don't get resolved very easily. They get passed on from generation to generation, and they tend to live on in the traumatic memories of the groups that identify with them, and then they just act them out from generation to generation. So the question of how do we heal them, I don't think we have any easy answers to that. If we did, our 300-year history of slavery and racism would have been resolved a couple hundred years ago, but it just seems to be passed on again and again. And so the notion, say, of reparations for slavery, well, that's an idea financial reparations. That's an idea of healing, but then there's such resistance to it that it provokes more racism and more antagonism. Maybe one of the few, and I don't know whether it was successful or not, but in South Africa, they had the healing and reconciliation around apartheid. And a lot of people sort of celebrated that as a healing ritual for transgenerational communication of traumatic events. I don't know how success. If you went to South Africa today, would you say that was successful? Has that been healed?
Very good question. It takes probably many generations before there's anything that can approach the kind of healing when we're talking about something like apartheid, would be my guess. But also, I've always been felt a little resistant to the idea of cultural complexes because culture is so complex in its own right. I mean, the sense of, I know you've written a lot about this, and I've admired your writing about Southeast Asian cultural complexes and American and Australian. I mean, you've gone around the globe. But you're talking about nations that have many national identities, many cultural complexities within, I think I may have said complexities before instead of complexes. And it gets me back to Jung in a way, because Jung writes about the collective unconscious. And I know there's a lot of meaning that's been ascribed to this idea of some universal unconscious. But I remember teaching Eugene O'Neill's The Emperor Jones, for example, and the idea of a cultural complex or a collective unconscious for Black people seemed to me to be racist. It still does. That one could, in other words, attribute certain notions to a people based on their racial heritage and their racial history when family history is so different, when economic histories are so different. Like I say, nations within nation.
Well, I think your suspicion or resistance to the notion of cultural complexes is well founded in the sense that I think we resist anything that seems to be too simplistic and reductive, and so I think it's very easy to see the notion of cultural complexes as being too simplistic and reductive in the sense of boiling everything down to a single complex, when in fact culture is very complex. It's far more complex than a single complex. And at the same time, I think in large groups of people, things get simplistic. If you look at our political process and you look at what the debates were about in this election, what was it? It's abortion, and it's inflation, and it's immigration.
And also transgender identity, and that's much more important than people, I think, have been given credit for.
Yes, and transgender identity. So these are all flashpoints. They're trigger, what I would call trigger words. Transgender it's a very potent trigger word, as immigration is a very important trigger word, and abortion is a very important trigger word. And what does it trigger? It triggers very powerful, divisive emotion and very simplistic ideas of right and wrong on both sides. It triggers very powerful memories that go along with pain around immigration, or pain around abortion, or pain around transgender. I think these things, when they come alive in large groups of people, become simplistic. And in that sense, I think they are complexes. Complexes are simplistic in a way. They're reductionistic in a way. They reduce things to very basic kind of black and white things. That's why they're complexes.
And that's why they're complex.
And that's why they're complex.
And here's Grace from Nashville, Tennessee, with perhaps one of the most challenging questions of them all. And we've had some very good questions. But she says, how does our unconscious drive our conscious decisions? Well, from a Jungian perspective, if you will, or from your perspective.
What was the slip I made about nuclear women?
Yes.
So I'll reflect on my own slip. That was probably an unconscious slip, whether it was Jungian or Freudian. And nuclear women, if you think about that, means that there's a powerful divide between the sexes and often antagonism and hostility. And so something from my unconscious slipped into nuclear weapon and war and made it into the war between men and women. That's probably I would claim that as an unconscious slip that I made. So it worked, some unconscious conflict that I have, and it's not so unconscious. I'm pretty aware of the conflict, but it slips into our everyday life, and these determine our feelings and determine our behaviors. And
well, we were joking about being in the doghouse before we went before we went into the podcast live, and that may have actually triggered something in you.
Well, it certainly did. So we went from doghouse to nuclear women. And that makes absolute sense, doesn't it?
It does, especially if you believe in. Was Jung a close adherent to the idea of what Freud called the psychopathology of everyday life? In other words, these slips having so much revelatory meaning to the unconscious?
I do believe in that. I think any modern psychoanalyst or psychotherapist no longer identifies exclusively with Freud or Jung, but has to be eclectic. And I think the psychopathology of everyday life, which was one of Freud's earliest and most important books, it's very real. Of course, I do believe in that.
Can you also maybe talk a little bit about the efficacy of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy? In fact, let's keep them separate because they certainly warrant being kept separate, and talk about it from your perspective as, a healer, as someone who has worked with people's problems, both neurotic and maybe even more serious in psychotic territories, because there has been, I think, a diminution of belief and trust and, frankly, confidence in especially psychotherapy, but also even maybe more psychoanalysis.
Yes, well, it tends to be very long-term and very costly, and we live in a very pragmatic society in which we want instant or quick results, and so there's a lot in our culture which would be against a process that takes a long time and a lot of thought and a lot of money and a lot of suffering. And there's no guarantee when one enters into psychotherapy or psychoanalysis that it's going to be a positive outcome. My own experiences over time, and I've been doing it for 50 years, a lot of us have become sort of more, quote, relational. And we do believe that a good enough relationship between a therapist or an analyst and a patient, a good enough relationship can be healing in the sense that people have an opportunity to talk about things that they never can talk to anybody about. And sometimes in that kind of catharsis, you actually begin to learn something about yourself and not necessarily repeat the same kinds of unconscious, deeply ingrained behaviors and feelings. So I believe it can be helpful. And I've also certainly had experiences where it's not been helpful, where I've failed miserably and felt very badly. And in baseball, if you hit over 300 now, you're doing very well. Maybe the same is true in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. It doesn't always work, but I think good relationships allow people to very slowly and gradually change and open up their darker, deeper feelings, have a room to be able to come alive without having to be acted out in self-destructive ways or ways that destroy relationships. So I think it's still of great value.
What do you say to the argument, I'm sure you've heard it, that you can have this catharsis and get this relational value from a friend or from an acquaintance who's perceptive and insightful and cares about you and, can be very important in terms of enlightenment too?
Well, I think friendships are invaluable, and I think without friendships we're impoverished. I do think there are kind of professional relationships. I came to know Robert Lifton through this Dangerous Case book, and he talks a lot about professional witnessing. And he means that both professional witnessing of some of the great horrors of the 20th and 21st century, like the Holocaust and the Nazi doctors, or Hiroshima and the people who suffered from that. So there's a professional witnessing of large collective events. There's a professional witnessing that goes along with a psychotherapeutic relationship where one is trained to be a certain kind of witness. It doesn't mean objective in a cold and detached way, but trained not to get pulled in immediately to the conflicts that tend to swirl around psychotherapeutic relationships. So I think professional witnessing is a very important aspect of psychotherapy that's different than a friendship.
How important is transference then, as far as you're concerned, or from a Jungian point of view? For Freud, it was central, the idea that a patient comes in and transfers feelings toward a parent or an authority figure or whatever onto the therapist or the analyst. How central is that?
I think the notion of transference is central to any psychotherapeutic relationship because at its best, a patient or a client is projecting the wish for some kind of healing and resolution onto the healer. And if the healer can carry that transference well enough, then it allows some healing to go on. And so I think, and of course, transference also has its negative aspects where you become the negative father or the negative mother. And there's the opportunity in that to be able to re-experience some of the more painful and traumatic early childhood traumas. So I think transference is essential, whether you're a Freudian or a Jungian or a relational analyst or therapist.
A lot of the work and writing you do is based on sort of an interpretation of symbolism. And I was thinking about the Statue of Liberty. Just throw this at you because it's something that fascinates me. You may have read Paul Auster's novel about a terrorist who was taking replicas of the Statue of Liberty and destroying them to show his anger at the American Republic not delivering what it was supposed to. And I think you write at one point about the Statue of Liberty. That's what brought it to my mind. On the one hand, you see Emma Lazarus's words and you think, give me, you're tired, you're poor immigrants being welcomed into the United States, being part of the fabric and very heart of our nation's history and so forth. On the other hand, it's looked upon as being a promise that can't be fulfilled, or it's looked upon as something to be disdained even. It's just such a charged symbol is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the Statue of Liberty is enormously charged. We had a conference recently at the C.G. Jung Institute in San Francisco. It was our 7th consecutive presidency conference. We have it every 4 years. And we used as the primary symbolic image for this year a drawing by a 19-year-old who did a kind of postmodern, high-tech drawing of the Statue of Liberty, which is totally wired. Everything is wired about it. And I chose it as our symbol because right now, the ideas around freedom, which the Statue of Liberty represents, freedom and liberty, are so divided in our country that that those on the right have one idea of freedom and those on the left have another idea about freedom. So it's no longer a symbol that brings us together. It's no longer a uniting symbol. It's actually become a divisive symbol. And even the little poem at the bottom of it has become words of division. We don't welcome the immigrants anymore. And the very purpose of the Statue of Liberty is now in question, that we can no longer welcome the teeming and roiling poor from other countries. And so it's become a symbol almost of division rather than healing. And of deep conflict. What do we mean by freedom? Does freedom mean you have the right to carry an AK-17 and do whatever you want with it? Is that what freedom is? Does freedom involve any sense of responsibility to the community, or does freedom mean you can do whatever you want?
Well, you were talking before about xenophobia, and xenophobia has been translated in some ways to not I'm sorry. Well, I was thinking more about what you were saying about the media actually before, and the lack of trust, perhaps for many good reasons, in the media we have now. There are those who would argue that the media should. I'll give you a case that's going on now that was just resolved. A Venezuelan migrant, as he's called by the Washington Post, or the New York Times, as opposed to an illegal immigrant, is responsible for the rape and murder of a young woman, and he was tried and convicted and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And there are those who object to the way, let's say, xenophobia is avoided by not calling him an illegal immigrant, calling him either undocumented or saying something to the effect that he's a Venezuelan national. I mean, language gets dressed up in different ways through the media, depending what the media views as its role and responsibility. This gets very complicated in terms of how things should be represented and how they should be explained and what even the narrative should be. I mean, all people who are seeking sanctuary here be identified with this kind of horror? In many people's minds, yes. The answer is yes. In so many people's minds, the answer is of course not.
Yeah. Well, I would argue, Michael, that we have such trouble with words because words are triggers to cultural complexes. And so as soon as you say...
I know that's your argument, yes.
So as soon as you say illegal immigrant, because of how Donald Trump played that, you think of somebody coming into your kitchen and slashing your throat. That was very effective on the part of Trump. The use of language has become so tricky because, in my opinion, so many of these words are trigger words for very powerful cultural complexes that carry tremendous emotional weight and all sorts of powerful black and white ideas and historic memories. So if you say illegal immigrant, because Trump was so effective at terrorizing people with the fear of the monstrous illegal immigrants, that as soon as you say illegal immigrant, you raise the fear of mayhem, death, destruction, the decline of the United States. And so when you use that language, you're carrying all the baggage of the cultural complex that immediately gets unpacked or carried along with the word. And so we end up like we have to be so careful about our language. Like woke is such a powerful word, or political correctness was in 2016. And these, from my point of view, these potent words are really triggers to emotionally laden complexes that stimulate deep responses in people, and they have automatic reactions, either pro or against, and you're off to the races. There's no conversation and there's no thinking possible once you've triggered that complex.
There's a lot about that and more that those of you who listen to this podcast can learn in the book that was edited by Tom Singer and a couple of others called Mind of State, which is out and I believe still available. And I want to thank all of you who did join us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't become a member of the podcast, join by going to our website at graymatter.show, and you can find previous episodes there, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you may have to me at mkrasny at graymatter.show. I want to thank our team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to this week's guest, Tom Singer. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.